Hello there. Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the final chapter, chapter 18 of Ouspensky's In Search of the Miraculous. I'm sure you know what In Search of the Miraculous is about by now after 17 previous chapters, but if you don't, it's Ouspensky's documentation of his time spent with Gurdjieff in Russia from 1916 to we're arriving at around 1920, and then there's a little bit about 21 and a few paragraphs speaking about where Gurdjieff heads off to. Of course, as always, I'll read the contents of the chapter in a moment, but just like to say hello there to Frank, who's been looking forward to this chapter, and this is the first live that you've caught, so welcome. Nice to see you. And yeah, before we get into this, I'd just like to say thanks to everyone who's contributed, commented, asked a question, and found value in these readings, because for me, it's a very special and powerful book in my own life, which is why I wanted to share it in full like this with the text and audio for people for it to be more easily accessible. And yeah, I'm very happy with how it's gone, and I've mentioned in the last few videos that we're going to read Gurdjieff's own writings, Meetings with Remarkable Men, next. So very different taste, much less conceptual, metaphysical, no diagrams at all. It's more of a semi-autobiography, so I'm very much looking to share that, and Gurdjieff's writing has a different weight to Ouspensky's, which I'm sure you will all feel in time. And there's a brief mention in this chapter of Catherine Mansfield. And I believe if you search Book Club Live Reading Catherine Mansfield, I've read one or two of her short stories. And so, yeah, there's an interesting connection in one of the books, I can't remember. But Catherine Mansfield, I believe, goes to be with Gurdjieff to see out her life. And of course, there's a lot of controversy about this because all sorts of rumors start flying around about what's happened. But I'm sure, if my memory serves me, that's what happens. But thanks everyone for coming, and I'll just go through the contents quickly, and then we'll begin. And as I've said in the chat, any questions or comments I'll address at the end. And this is what we're going to read about. Petersburg in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, return to G in the Caucasus, G's attitude to one of his pupils, a small company with G at Essentuki, more people arrive, resumption of work, exercises are more difficult and varied than before, mental and physical exercises, dervish dances, study of psychic tricks, selling silk, inner struggle and the decision, the choice of gurus, the decision to separate, G goes to Sochi, a difficult time, warfare and epidemics, further study of the Enneagram, events and the necessity of leaving Russia, London, the final aim, practical results of work on oneself, feeling a new I, a strange confidence, collecting a group in Rostov and expounding G's system, G opens his institute in Tiflis, journey to Constantinople, collecting people, G arrives, new group introduced to G, translating a dervish song, G the artist and poet, the institute started in Constantinople, G authorizes the writing and publishing of a book, G goes to Germany, decision to continue Constantinople work in London, 1921 G organizes his institute in Fontainebleau, the prairie, or there you go, work at the Chateau de la Prairie, and I can never pronounce Prairie right, forgive me. A talk with Catherine Mansfield, G speaks of different kinds of breathing through movements, demonstrations at the Theatre des Champs-Élysées, Pans, G's departure for America in 1924, and decision to continue the work in London independently. And so there's a lot to get through in this chapter, and I think a few people have asked previously about Ouspensky's decision to leave Gurdjieff and go his own way. And I think because at this period of time that we're going to learn about, Gurdjieff, I don't know about updating the system, but the system from this point forward, I feel from my own studies and readings, became a lot less psychological, a lot less cosmological, and a lot more sort of, there's more being, more doing, more experiential. So a lot less intellectual center and more moving and emotional center, and I think that's why Ouspensky may have drifted away, because he's all about the intellectual stuff. And if you read any books from the Fontainebleau, the Priere, forgive me, from that time forward, no one's talking about diagrams and all of these things that were spoke about in Russia previously. So just thought I'd share those anecdotes with you. And yes, let's get right into it. The 18th and final chapter of Ouspensky's In Search of the Miraculous. I was kept in St. Petersburg longer than I had thought to be, and I only left there on the 15th of October, a week before the Bolshevik Revolution. It was quite impossible to stay there any longer. Something disgusting and clammy was drawing near. A sickly tension and the expectation of something inevitable could be felt in everything. Rumours were creeping about, each one more absurd and stupid than the other. Nobody understood anything. Nobody could imagine what was coming later on. The temporary government, having vanquished Kornilov, conducted the most correct negotiations with the Bolsheviks, who openly showed they did not care a hang for the socialist ministers and tried only to gain time. The Germans, for some reason, did not march upon St. Petersburg, although the front was open. People now thought of them as saviours, both from the temporary government and from the Bolsheviks. I did not share the hopes based upon the Germans because, in my opinion, what was taking place in Russia had to a considerable extent got out of hand. In Tupas there was still comparative calm. Some kind of Soviet was sitting in the country house of the Shah of Persia, but plunderings had not yet begun. G settled down at a fair distance from Tupas to the south, a little over 15 miles from Sochi. He hired a country house there overlooking the sea, brought a pair of horses, and lived with a small company of people. Altogether about 10 persons were gathered there. I went there too. It was a wonderful place, full of roses, with a view of the sea on one side and a chain of mountains already covered with snow on the other. I was very sorry for those of our people who had stayed in Moscow and St. Petersburg. But even on the day following my arrival, I noticed that there was something wrong. There was not a trace of the Essentuki atmosphere. I was particularly astonished at Z's position. When I had left for St. Petersburg in the beginning of September, Z was full of enthusiasm. He continually urged me not to stay in St. Petersburg, since it might become difficult to get through. "Do you never intend to be in St. Petersburg any more?" I asked him then. "One who flees to the mountains does not turn back," Z replied. And now, on the day following my arrival in Ukh-Der, I heard that Z intended to return to St. Petersburg. What can he be going back there for? He has left his employment. What is he going to do there? "I do not know," said Dr. S., who had told me about it. "G is not pleased with him and says that he had better go." It was difficult for me to get Z himself into a talk. He obviously did not desire to explain, but he said that he really intended to leave. Gradually, by questioning others, I found out that a strange thing had happened. A very absurd quarrel between G and some Lets, our neighbours, had occurred. Z was present at it. G had not liked something Z had said, or something, and from that day he had completely changed towards him, stopped speaking to him, and, in general, put him into such a position that Z was obliged to announce his decision to leave. I considered this to be pure idiocy. To go to St. Petersburg at this time seemed to me the height of absurdity. There was a real famine there, unruly crowds, robbery, and nothing else. At that time, of course, one could not yet have imagined that we should never see St. Petersburg again. I counted upon going there in the spring. I thought that by the spring there would be something definite, but now in the winter this was quite unreasonable. I could have understood it if Z, I don't know, I'm changing between one. I could have understood if Z was interested in politics and was studying the events of the period, but as this was not the case, I saw no motives for it whatever. I began to persuade Z to wait, to decide nothing at once, to talk to G and to try somehow to clarify the position. Z promised me not to be in a hurry, But I saw that he was indeed in a very strange position. G completely ignored him, and this produced on Z a most depressing impression. 2 weeks passed in this way. My arguments had worked on Z, and he said that he would stay if G agreed to let him. He went to speak to G, but came back very soon with a disturbed face. Well, what did he say to you? Nothing in particular. He said that once I had decided to go, I had better go. Z went. I could not understand it. I would not have let a dog go to St. Petersburg at that time. G intended to pass the winter at Ukhdere. We lived in several houses spread over a large plot of land. There was no kind of work in the sense of what had been at Essentuki. We chopped up trees for winter firewood. We collected wild pears. G often went to Sochi, where one of our people was in hospital, having contracted typhoid before my arrival from St. Petersburg. Unexpectedly, G decided to go to another place. He found that here we might easily be cut off from all communication with the rest of Russia and be left without provisions. G went away with half of our company and afterwards sent Dr. S for the rest. We again foregathered in Tupas, and from there we began to make excursions along the seashore to the north where there was no railway. During one of these trips, S found some of his St. Petersburg acquaintances who had a country house 24 miles north of Tupas. We stayed the night with them, and the next morning G hired a house half a mile away from there. Here our small company again foregathered. 4 went to Essentuki. Here we lived for 2 months. It was a very interesting time. G, Dr. S and I went to Tupas every week for provisions for ourselves and fodder for the horses. These trips will always remain in my memory. They were full of the most improbable adventures and very interesting talks. Our house stood overlooking the sea 3 miles from the big village of Olgniki. I had hoped that we would live there a longer time. But in the second half of December, there came the rumours that a part of the Caucasian army was moving towards Russia on foot along the shores of the Black Sea. G said that we would again go to Essentuki and begin fresh work. I went first. I took part of our belongings to Pietergorst and returned. It was possible to get through altogether. It was possible to get through, although there were Bolsheviks in Armavir. The Bolsheviks in general had increased in the North Caucasus, and friction began between them and the Cossacks. At Mineralny Vody, when we all passed through there, everything was outwardly quiet, although murders of many persons whom the Bolsheviks disliked had already occurred. G hired a large house in Essentuki and sent out a circular letter dated the 12th of February over my signature to all the members of our Moscow and St. Petersburg groups, inviting them to come with those near to them to live and to work with him. There was already famine in St. Petersburg and Moscow, but there was still an abundance of everything in the Caucasus. To get through now was not easy, and several failed in spite of their desire to do so. But many came, although about 40 people assembled. With them came Z, to whom also a letter had been sent. He arrived quite ill. In February, while we were still waiting, G once said, when he was showing me the house and everything he had arranged, "Now do you understand why we collected money in Moscow and St. Petersburg? You said then that 1,000 rubles was too much, and will even this money be enough? 1.5 persons paid. I have now already spent more than was collected then." G intended to hire or buy a plot of land, arrange kitchen gardens, and in general to organize a colony, but he was prevented by the events which had begun during summer. When our people assembled in March 1918, very strict rules were established in our house. It was forbidden to leave the grounds, day and night orderlies were established, and so on, and work of the most varied kind began. In the organization of the house and of our lives, there was very much of interest. Exercises on this occasion were much more difficult and varied than during the preceding summer. We began rhythmic exercises to music, dervish dances, different kinds of mental exercises, the study of different ways of breathing, and so on. Particularly intensive were the exercises for studying various imitations of psychic phenomena, thought reading, clairvoyance, mediumistic displays, and so forth. Before these exercises began, G explained to us that the study of these tricks, as he called them, was an obligatory subject in all Eastern schools, because without having studied all possible counterfeits and imitations, it was not possible to begin the study of phenomena of a supranormal character. A man is in a position to distinguish the real from the sham in this sphere only when he knows all the shams and is able to reproduce them himself. Besides this, G said that a practical study of these psychic tricks was in itself an exercise which could be replaced by nothing else, which was the best of all for developing certain special characteristics, keenness of observation, shrewdness, and more particularly for the enlargement of other characteristics for which there are no words in ordinary psychological language, but which must certainly be developed. But the principal part of the work which began at that time were the rhythmics to music and similar strange dances, which afterwards led to the reproduction of the exercises of various dervishes. G did not explain his aims and intentions, but according to things he had said before, it was possible to think that the result of these exercises would be to bring under control the physical body. In addition to exercises, dances, gymnastics, talks, lectures, and housework, special work was organized for those without means. I remember that when we were leaving Alexandropol the year before, G took with him a box of skein silk, which, he told me, he had bought cheaply at a sale. This silk always travelled with him. When our people assembled in Essentuki, G gave this silk to the women and children to wind onto star-shaped cards, which were also made in our house. Then some of our people who possessed commercial talents sold this silk to shops in Petersburg, Kislovodsk, and Essentuki itself. One must remember that time. There were absolutely no goods whatever. Shops were empty, and the silk was snapped up at once, because such things as silk, cotton, and so on were unbelievably difficult to obtain. This work continued for 2 months and gave a sure and regular income quite out of proportion with the original cost of the silk. A fine investment by Mr. Gurdjieff, it seems, and like you say, he's was able to foresee that the silk would become very sought after and expensive, so yeah, a good investment. In normal times, a colony like ours could not have existed in Essentuki, nor probably anywhere else in Russia. We should have excited curiosity. We should have attracted attention. The police would have appeared. Some kind of scandal would undoubtedly have arisen. All possible kinds of accusations would have made their appearance. Political tendencies would certainly have been ascribed to us, or sectarian or anti-moral. People are made in such a way that they invariably make accusations against the things they fail to understand. But at that time, that is, in 1918, those who would have been curious about us were occupied in saving their own skins from the Bolsheviks, and the Bolsheviks were not yet strong enough to be interested in the lives of private people or private organizations having no direct political character. And seeing that among the intellectuals from the capital who found themselves by the will of fate at Mineralny Vody at that time, a number of groups and working associations had just been organized, nobody paid any attention to us. On one occasion during general conversation in the evening, G said that we must think of a name for our colony and in general legalize ourselves. This was at the time of the Petersburg Bolshevik government. Think out something like Sodrozevstvo, I don't know how to pronounce that, Sodrozevstvo, and earned by work, or international at the same time, said G. In any case, they will not understand, but it is necessary for them to be able to give us some kind of name. We began in turn to propose various designations. Public lectures were arranged in our house twice a week, to which a fair number of people came, and once or twice we gave demonstrations of imitation psychic phenomena, which were not very successful, since our public submitted very poorly to instruction. But my personal position in G's work began to change. For a whole year something had been accumulating, and I gradually began to see that there were many things I could not understand, and that I had to go. This may appear strange and unexpected after all I have written so far, but it had accumulated gradually. I wrote that I had for some time begun to separate G and the ideas. I had no doubt about the ideas. On the contrary, the more I thought of them, the deeper I entered into them, the more I began to value them and realize their significance. But I began very strongly to doubt that it was possible for me, or even for the majority of our company, to continue to work under G's leadership. I do not in the least mean that I found any of G's actions or methods wrong, or that they failed to respond to what I expected. This would be strange and completely out of place in connection with a leader in work, the esoteric nature of which I have admitted. The one excludes the other. In work of such a nature, there can be no sort of criticism, no sort of disagreement with this or that person. On the contrary, all work consists in doing what the leader indicates, understanding in conformance with his opinions even those things that he does not say plainly, helping him in everything that he does. There can be no other attitude towards the work. And G himself said several times that a most important thing in the work was to remember that one came to learn and to take no other role upon oneself. At the same time, this does not at all mean that a man has no choice, or that he is obliged to follow something which does not respond to what he is seeking. G himself said that there are no general schools, that each guru or leader of a school works at his own speciality. One is a sculptor, another is a musician, a third is again something else, and that all the pupils of such a guru have to study his speciality. And it stands to reason that here a choice is possible. A man has to wait until he meets a guru whose speciality he is able to study, a speciality which suits his tastes, his tendencies, and his abilities. There is no doubt that there may be very interesting ways, like music and like sculpture, but it cannot be that every man should be required to learn music or sculpture. In schoolwork there are undoubtedly obligatory subjects, and there are, if it is possible to put it in this way, auxiliary subjects, the study of which is proposed merely as a means of studying, the obligatory. Then the methods of the schools may differ very much. According to the three ways, the methods of each guru may approximate either to the way of the fakir, the way of the monk, or the way of the yogi. And it is of course possible that a man who is beginning work will make a mistake, will follow a leader such as he cannot follow for any distance. It stands to reason that it is the task of the leader to see to it that people do not begin to work with him, for whom his methods or his special subjects will always be alien, incomprehensible, and unattainable. But if this does happen, and if a man had begun to work with a leader whom he cannot follow, then of course, having noticed and realized this, he ought to go and seek another leader or work independently, if he is able to do so. In regard to my relations with G, I saw clearly at this time that I had been mistaken about many things that I had ascribed to G, and that by staying with him now, I should not be going in the same direction I went at the beginning. And I thought that all the members of our small group, with very few exceptions, were in the same or in a similar situation. This was a very strange observation, but it was absolutely a right one, and I had nothing to say against G's methods except that they did not suit me. A very clear example came to my mind then. I had never had a negative attitude towards the way of the monk, to religious, mystical ways. At the same time, I could never have thought for one moment that such a way was possible for me or suitable. And so, if after 3 years of work I perceived that G was leading us in fact towards the way of religion, of the monastery, and required the observance of all religious forms and ceremonies, there would be, of course, a motive for disagreeing with this and for going away, even though at the risk of losing direct leadership. And certainly this would not at the same time mean that I considered the religious way a wrong way in general. It may even be a more correct way than my way, but it is not my way. The decision to leave G's work and leave him exacted from me a great inner struggle. I had built very much upon it, and it was difficult for me now to reconstruct everything from the beginning. But there was nothing else to do. Of course, all that I had learned during those 3 years I retained. But a whole year passed by while I was going into all this, and until I found it possible to continue to work in the same direction as G, but independently. I went into a separate house and began work, abandoned in St. Petersburg, on my book, which afterwards appeared under the title A New Model of the Universe. In the home, lectures and demonstrations still continued for a certain time and then stopped. Sometimes I met G in the park or on the street. Sometimes he came to my house, but I avoided going to the home. At this time, the position of affairs in the North Caucasus began to get very much worse. We were completely cut off from central Russia. What was going on there we did not know. After the first Cossack raid on Essentuki, the position quickly began to change for the worse, and G decided to leave Mineralny Vody. Where he actually intended to go he did not say, and it was difficult to say having regard to the circumstances of the time. The public who had left Mineralny Vody at that time had tried to get through to Novorossiysk, and I supposed that he would also go in that direction. I also decided to leave Essentuki, but I did not want to leave before he did. In this respect, I had a strange kind of feeling. I wanted to wait until the end, to do everything that depended upon me so that afterwards I could tell myself that I had not let a single possibility escape me. It was very difficult for me to reject the idea of working with G. In the beginning of August, G left Essentuki. Most of those living in the home left with him. A few people had gone earlier. About 10 persons were left in Essentuki. I decided to go to Novorossiysk, but circumstances began to change swiftly. Within a week of G's departure, communications, even with places nearest to us, came to a stop. Cossacks began to raid the branch line to Mineralny Vody, and where we were, Bolshevik robberies, requisitions, and so on began. This was the time of the massacre of hostages in Pyatigorsk, when General Russky, General Radko Dmitriev, and Prince Urusov, and many others perished. Hello there, Google sucks. Thanks for your words there, and yeah, I'm glad you've enjoyed the series. And when we come to a break, I'm going to comment on all this that Ouspensky's talking about here. So yeah, but I'll get to a break first, I think, in paragraphs. I must confess that I felt very silly. I had not gone abroad when it was possible in order to stop to work with G, and the final outcome was that I had parted from G and stopped with the Bolsheviks. All of us who had stayed in Essentuki had to live through a very difficult time. For me and my family, things turned out comparatively favorably. Only 2 people out of 4 got ill with typhoid. No one died. Not once were we robbed, and all the time I had work and earned money. Things were much worse for others. In January 1919, we were set free by the Cossacks in Denikin's army, but I was only able to leave Essentuki in the following summer of 1919. The news we had of G was very brief. He had travelled by railway to Maykop, and from there the whole of the party with him went on foot by a very interesting but very difficult way, through the mountains to the sea at Sochi, which had then been seized by the Georgians. Carrying with them the whole of their baggage, they walked with all possible kinds of adventures and dangers over lofty passes where there were no roads and where hunters crossed but seldom. It was apparently only about a month after their departure from Essentuki that they reached Sochi. But the inner situation had changed. In Sochi, the greater part of the company, as I had foreseen, parted company with G. Among them were P and Z. Only 4 people stayed with G, of whom Dr. S alone belonged to the original St. Petersburg group. The others had only been in young groups. In February, P, who had established himself in Maykop after the rupture with G, came to Essentuki for his mother, who had remained there, and from him we learned the details of everything that had taken place on the way to and on arrival at Sochi. Moscow people had gone to Kiev. G, with his 4 companions, had gone to Tiflis. In the spring we learned that he was continuing work in Tiflis with new people and in a new direction, basing it principally on art, that is, on music, dances, and rhythmic exercises. And so, yeah, I'll just comment there briefly on everything that Ouspensky's saying, and I suppose this is my opinion, right? Normally I like to take the text and comment on what Gurdjieff is saying ultimately, but here this is Ouspensky telling us. And I feel there's a part of me, if I can speak openly with you guys, that if we say that Gurdjieff is the teacher, of course, Ouspensky's learning from Gurdjieff. Early on in the book, if you go back to chapter 1 or 2 or 3, one of the early chapters, Gurdjieff is well aware of Ouspensky. He knows that he has all these intellectual ideas. He knows of his book, Tertium Organum, and he says to him at one point, you know, if you understood everything that you've written in Tertium Organum, you'd be teaching me. And so he knew he was this intellectual, that he loved these sort of ideas. And so, you know, reflecting and rereading this book, talking it out loud, sharing it with you, there is a possibility that Gurdjieff gave all these ideas to Ouspensky, knowing that he would publish a book about them. In the beginning, Ouspensky says, you know, you must permit me to write about these things and talk about these things, because how do I know if I got an idea from you or if it's my original idea? So I'm going to have to be able to write about it. As Gurdjieff saying, yes, that's fine, but let me give the whole system first. And so perhaps Gurdjieff knew that Ouspensky would be taken with these intellectual ideas, with all the diagrams, all the concepts, etc. Similar to myself, I enjoy these things, which is why I'm sharing this book first. So I've got nothing against Ouspensky. But when he'd given him all the ideas, all of the concepts, the material to go into this book, maybe he felt, well, I've done that now. I can't keep going over these ideas. He's got to deal with it himself. And like Ouspensky's just shared there in that previous section, the work began to change, the nature of the work. There were these dervish dances, there were these movements, the music, different sort of energy to the work. And so it's my opinion, and even there I was going to mention when I said it, but Ouspensky, let me just go back a section. Where are we? Let me, don't forget where we are and get lost. But here he says, I've just gone back a section. I think it's on the previous page. Yeah, look here, on the 6th line up. In the beginning of August, G left Essentuki. Most of those living in the home, capital H, in brackets, left with him. A few people had gone earlier, about 10 persons were left. And then I think he says here, he says it again like it is. Sorry, I'll get back. This is the page on. But this, the way he's talking about it is a disparaging way, in my opinion. You know, the home in quotation marks. And previously, early on, Ouspensky would have been right there in the home because he wanted to get all the information that he could from Gurdjieff so he could note it down and publish this book. But now the home, you know, they're doing different things, dervish dances, ceremonial stuff, the way of the monk, like he's saying, and that didn't resonate with Ouspensky. And so, like he says, he goes off and eventually continues the work independently in London. And again, on reflection and thinking about it now, reading this chapter, he sort of attracts towards him the intellectuals who like all these ideas and diagrams and etc., who I'd include myself in that camp. But I understand that it's about connecting all of the centers and about raising being. It's not about just having all the ideas at your, you know, reciting them parrot fashion. You have to raise up your being along the lines and level at the same rate as your knowledge and being have to progress together. Otherwise, I can't remember what he says, but there's sort of two, you either know everything but can't do nothing, or you can do everything but you don't know what to do. So that was my little rant there about perhaps why Ouspensky may be leaving. And of course, we're only halfway through the chapter, so maybe Ouspensky will tell us more himself. But that's how I interpret it and what I see. And so I thought I'd share that with you. Back to the text now. At the end of winter, when conditions of living became slightly easier, I began to look through my notes and drawings of G's diagrams, which with G's permission I had preserved since St. Petersburg. My attention was particularly attracted by the Enneagram. The explanation of the Enneagram had clearly not been finished, and I felt that there were in it hints at a possible continuation. I very soon saw that a continuation must be sought in connection with the wrong situation of the shock which came into the Enneagram at the interval Sol-La. Then I turned my attention to what the Moscow notes in connection with commentaries on the Enneagram and about the influences of the three octaves on one another in the food diagram. I drew the Enneagram as it had been given to us, and I saw that it represented, up to a certain point, the food diagram. So this is Ouspensky now, going back to his notes, thinking about it, and coming up with his own ideas related to this. The point 3, or interval Mi-Fa, was the place where the shock came in, which gave Do 192 of the second octave. When I added the beginning of this octave to the Enneagram, I saw that the point 6 came at the interval Mi-Fa of the second octave, and the shock in the form of the third octave, Do 48, which begins at this point. The completed drawing of the octaves came out as follows. So yeah, get your teeth into that. He's obviously adding additional octaves on top of the previous octaves. This signified that there was no wrong place for a shock at all. Point 6 showed the entry of the shock in the second octave, and the shock was the Do which began the third octave. All three octaves reached hydrogen 2. In one it was C in the second Sol, and in the third Mi. The second octave, which ended at 12 in the Enneagram, ought to have gone on further, but C12 and Mi12 required an additional shock. I thought a great deal about the nature of these shocks, and at that time, but I will speak of them later. I felt that there was very much material in the Enneagram. Points 1, 2, 4, 5, 7, 8 represented, according to the food diagram, different systems of the organism. 1, the digestive system. 2, the breathing system. 4, the bloodstream. 5, the brain. 7, the spinal cord. 8, the sympathetic system and the sex organs. According to this, the direction of the inner lines 1, 4, 2, 8, 5, 7, 1, that is, the content of fraction 7, showed the direction of the flow or distribution of arterial blood in the organism, and then its return in the form of venous blood. It was particularly interesting that the point of return was not the heart but the digestive system, which indeed is the case, since venous blood is first of all mixed with the products of digestion. It then goes to the right auricle, through the right ventricle, then to the lungs to absorb oxygen, and from there goes to the left auricle, and then the left ventricle, and then through the aorta into the arterial system. Examining the Enneagram further, I saw that the 7 points could represent the 7 planets of the ancient world. In other words, the Enneagram could be an astronomical symbol. When I took the order of the planets in the order of the days of the week, I obtained the following picture. And so here you go. This is the astronomical symbol. Excuse me. I did not try to go any further, as I did not have the necessary books to hand, and there was very little time. Events gave no time to go into philosophical speculations. One had to think about living, that is to say, simply and quite plainly, to think about where one could live and work. The revolution and everything connected with it aroused in me deep physical disgust. At the same time, in spite of my sympathy with the whites, I could not believe in their success. The Bolsheviks did not hesitate to promise things that neither they nor anyone else could perform. In this was their principal strength. It was something in which nobody could compete with them. In addition to this, they had the support of Germany, who saw in them a possibility of revenge in the future. The volunteer army, which had freed us from the Bolsheviks, was able to fight them and conquer them, but it was not able to organize in a proper way the cause of life in the liberated provinces. Its leaders had neither program, knowledge, nor experience in this direction. Of course, this could not be demanded of them, but facts are facts. The situation was very unstable, and the wave, which was still rolling towards Moscow at the time, could be rolled back again any day. It was necessary to get abroad. I had marked down London as my final aim. First, because I knew more people there, and second, because I thought that among the English I should find the greater response and greater interest in the new ideas I now had than anywhere else. Besides, when I was in London on my way to India before the war and on my return voyage at the beginning of the war, I had decided to go there to write and publish my book, which had begun in 1911 under the title The Wisdom of the Gods, and which subsequently appeared under the title of A New Model of the Universe. As a matter of fact, this book, in which I touched upon questions of religion, and in particular upon methods for studying the New Testament, could not have been published in Russia. So I decided to travel to London and to try to organize lectures and groups there like those at St. Petersburg. This only came to pass 3.5 years later. In the beginning of June 1919, I at last succeeded in leaving Essentuki. At that time it had become quite calm there and life had been a little re-established. But I did not trust this calm. It was necessary to go abroad. At first I went to Rostov and then to Ekaterinodar and Novorossiysk, and then returned again. Oh, good. Excuse me for all these terrible pronunciations. And then returned again to Ekaterinodar. Ekaterinodar at that time was the capital of Russia. There I met some of our company who had left Essentuki before me, as well as some friends and acquaintances from St. Petersburg. There remains in my memory one of my first talks. My friend from St. Petersburg asked me, when we had spoken of G-system and of work on oneself, whether I could indicate any practical results of this work. Remembering all I had experienced during the preceding year, particularly after G's departure, I said that I had acquired a strange confidence, one which I could not define in words, but which I must describe. This is not self-confidence in the ordinary sense, I said. Quite the contrary. Rather, is it a confidence in the unimportance and the insignificance of self, that self which we usually know. But what I am confident about is that if something terrible happened to me, like things that have happened to many of my friends during the past year, then it would be not I who would meet it, not this ordinary I, but another I within me who would be equal to the occasion. 2 years ago, G asked me whether I felt a new I inside me, and I had to answer that I felt no change whatever. Now I can speak otherwise, and I can explain how the change takes place. It does not take place at once. I mean that the change does not embrace every moment of life. All the ordinary life goes on in the ordinary way. All those very ordinary, stupid, small I's, accepting perhaps a few which have already become impossible. But if something big were to happen, something which would require the straining of every nerve, then I know that this big thing would be met, not by the ordinary small I which is now speaking, and which can be made afraid, nor by anything like it, but by another, a big I, which nothing can frighten, and which would be equal to everything that happened. I cannot describe it better. For me, it is a fact, and this fact is definitely connected for me with this work. You know my life, and you know that I was not afraid of many things, both inward and outward, that people are often afraid of. But this is something different, a different taste. Therefore, I know for myself that this new confidence has not come simply as a result of a great experience of life. It is the result of that work on myself which I began 4 years ago. So at this point, when he begins lecturing, obviously, he's just 4 years since he met Gurdjieff and is learning and studies and work on himself. In Ekaterinodar And afterwards, in Rostov during the winter, I collected together a small group and, on a plan that I had worked out the preceding winter, I gave them lectures expounding G's system as well as the things from ordinary life which led up to it. During the summer and autumn of 1919, I received 2 letters from G in Ekaterinodar and Novorossiysk. He wrote that he had opened in Tiflis an Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man on a very broad program and enclosed a prospectus of this institute, which made me very thoughtful indeed. The prospectus began in this way. With the permission of the Minister for National Education, the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man, based on GIG's system, is being opened in Tiflis. The Institute accepts children and adults of both sexes. Study will take place morning and evening. The subjects of studies are gymnastics of all kinds, rhythmical, medicinal and others, exercises for the development of will, memory, attention, hearing, thinking, emotion, instinct, and so on. To this was added that G.I. Gurdjieff's system was already in operation in a whole series of large cities such as Bombay, Alexandria, Kabul, New York, Chicago, Christiania, Stockholm, Moscow, Essentuki, and in all departments and homes of the true international and labouring fraternities. At the end of the prospectus, in a list of specialist teachers of the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man, I found my own name, as well as the names of mechanical engineer P and still another of our company, J, who was living at that time in Novorossiysk and had no intention whatever of going to Tiflis. G wrote in his letter that he was preparing his ballet, The Struggle of the Magicians, and without making any reference at all to past difficulties, he invited me to go and work with him in Tiflis. This was very characteristic of him, but for various reasons I could not go there. In the first place, there were very great material obstacles, and secondly, the difficulties which had arisen in Essentuki were for me very real ones. My decision to leave G had cost me very dear, and I could not give it up so easily, the more so as all his motives were to be seen. I must confess that I was not very enthusiastic about the program of the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man. I realized, of course, that it meant that G was obviously obliged to give some sort of outward form to his work, having regard to outward conditions, as he had done at Essentuki, and that this outward form was somewhat in the nature of a caricature. But I also realized that behind this outward form stood the same thing as before, and that this could not change. I was doubtful only of my own ability to adapt myself to this outward form. At the same time, I was confident that I should soon have to meet G again. P came to Ekaterinodar from Maykop, and we spoke together a great deal about the system and G. P was in fairly negative frame of mind, but it seemed to me that my idea that it was imperative to make a distinction between the system and G helped him to understand the position of affairs better. And this is what I was speaking about a few moments ago about Gurdjieff, and he says here, I was doubtful only of my own ability to adapt myself to this outward form. So again, Ouspensky liked the way that it was taught in Russia in 1916 and these 4 years he's talking about. He liked the intellectual way of things. But, and he keeps talking about separating, making a distinction between the system and G. And of course, the system comes from G, right? Gurdjieff has given him the intellectual side of the system, but you can't progress, or you can't progress fully or all the way with just the intellectual ideas, because clearly, if you know anything about the end of Ouspensky's life, he, it was very sad how his life ended. And so, yes, who knows what would happen or would have happened if he stayed with Gurdjieff, went to, Fontainebleau, and sort of continued to be under Gurdjieff's will and take what he would say and do what he would say. So, who knows? I was beginning to get very interested in my groups. I saw a possibility of continuing the work. The ideas of the system found a response and obviously answered the needs of people who wanted to understand what was taking place both in them and around them. And around us was being concluded that brief little epilogue to Russian history which had frightened our friends and allies so much. Ahead of us everything was quite dark. I was in Rostov in the autumn and beginning of winter. There I met another 2 or 3 of the St. Petersburg company as well as Z, who had arrived from Kiev. Z, like P, was in a very negative frame of mind in relation to all of the work. We settled down together in the same quarters, and it seemed that talks with me made him reverse many things and convince himself that the original valuations were right. He decided to try to get through to G in Tiflis, but he was not fated to accomplish this. We left Rostov almost at the same time, Z leaving 1 or 2 days after me, but he arrived in Novorossiysk already ill, and in the first days of January 1920 he died of the smallpox. Soon afterwards I managed to leave for Constantinople. At that time Constantinople was full of Russians. I met acquaintances from St. Petersburg, and with their assistance I began to give lectures in the offices of the Ruski Miak. I at once collected a fairly large audience, mostly of young men. I continued to develop the ideas begun in Rostov and Ekaterinodar, connecting general ideas of psychology and philosophy with ideas of esotericism. I got no further letters from G, but I was sure that he would come to Constantinople. He eventually arrived in June with a fairly large company. In former Russia, even in its distant outskirts, work had become impossible, and we were gradually approaching the period which I had foreseen in St. Petersburg, that is, of working in Europe. I was very glad to see G, and to me personally it seemed then that, in the interests of the work, all former difficulties could be set aside and that I could again work with him as in St. Petersburg. I brought G to my lectures and handed over to him all the people who came to my lectures, particularly the small group of about 30 persons who met upstairs in the offices of the Miak. G gave to the ballet the central position of his work at that time. Besides this, he wanted to organize a continuation of his Tiflis Institute in Constantinople, the principal place in which would be taken by dances and rhythmic exercises which would prepare people to take part in the ballet. According to his ideas, the ballet should become a school. I worked out the scenario of the ballet for him and began to understand this idea better. The dances and all the other numbers of the ballet, or rather revue, demanded a long and entirely special preparation. The people who were being prepared for the ballet and who were taking part in it would, in so doing, be obliged to study and to acquire control over themselves, in this way approaching the disclosure of the higher forms of consciousness. Into the ballet there entered, and as a necessary part of it, dances, exercises, and the ceremonies of various dervishes, as well as many little-known Eastern dances. It was a very interesting time for me. G often came to me in Principo. We went together through the Constantinople bazaars. We went to the Mehlevi dervishes, and he explained something to me that I had not been able to understand before. Marcella, hang around to the end and I'll share, I'll speak about it, but ultimately, drunk and in not very well, sort of mentally, not very mentally stable and drunk, as far as I remember from a book I read about the end of his life. So, yeah, it's very sad when you think about it. Sorry, back to the text. I can't resist. I say I'll answer. I've pinned the comment there that I'll talk about everything in the end, but I can't help myself. So, sorry about that, or you're welcome, whichever one, way you feel about it. And this was that of the whirling of the Mehlevi dervishes was an exercise for the brain based upon counting, like those exercises that he had shown to us in Essentuki. Sometimes I worked with him for entire days and nights. One such night in particular remains in my memory when we translated a dervish song for The Struggle of the Magicians. I saw G the artist and G the poet, whom he had so carefully hidden inside him, particularly the latter. This translation took the form of G recalling the Persian verses, sometimes repeating them to himself in a quiet voice, and then translating them for me into Russian. After a quarter of an hour, let us say, when I had completely disappeared beneath forms, symbols, and assimilations, he said, "There, now make one line out of that." I did not try to create any measure or to find a rhythm. This was quite impossible. G continued, and again, after a quarter of an hour, he said, "That is another line." We sat until the morning. This was in Kumbaraji Street, a little below the former Russian consulate. At length the town began to wake. I had written, I think, 5 verses and had stopped at the last line of the 5th verse. No kind of effort could make my brain turn any more. G laughed, but he also was tired and could not go on, so the verse remained as it was, unfinished, because he never returned to this song, And just another quick commentary about this, about Ouspensky's intellectual inclinations and how he likes all the intellectual stuff. If you read Thomas and Olga de Hartmann's works, or their book, Our Life with Mr. Gurdjieff, I think it's called, Gurdjieff knew that Thomas de Hartmann was a very famous composer, musician, and pianist. So this was clear. And he knew, Thomas de Hartmann knew that Gurdjieff had an idea to compose the music that you can find on YouTube or Apple Music, or wherever you listen to your music. Just type in Gurdjieff piano music, you'll find it. But he didn't broach it with de Hartmann for many years. And so I think he does this to sort of, help the ego. Because if he would have straight away got de Hartmann to help him with the piano music, de Hartmann would have this sense of ego about the music, about his role in things. So he almost has to sort of suppress that ego for a long time before he's then able let de Hartmann do the work on himself, before he's able to say, now we can do the work. So again, just another comment. 2 or 3 months passed by in this way. I helped G all I could in organizing his institute, but gradually the same difficulties arose before me as in Essentuki, so that when the institute was opened, I think in October, I was unable to join it. But in order not to hinder G or to give rise to discord among those who came to my lectures, I put an end to my own lectures and ceased to visit Constantinople. A few of those who came to my lectures visited me in Principe, and there we continued these talks begun in Constantinople. Two months later, when G's work had already become consolidated, I again started to give lectures at the MIAC in Constantinople, and I continued them for another 6 months. I visited G's institute from time to time, and sometimes he came to me in Principe. The inner relationship between us remained very good. In the spring, he proposed that I should give lectures in his institute, and I began to give lectures there once a week, in which G himself took part, supplementing my explanations. At the beginning of summer, G closed his institute and went over to Principe. Somewhere about this time, I told him in detail of a plan I had drawn up for a book to expound his St. Petersburg lectures and talks with commentaries of my own. He agreed to this plan and authorized me to write and publish it. I believe the very book we're reading. Up till then I had submitted to the general rule, obligatory for everyone, which concerned G's work. According to this rule, nobody under any circumstances had the right to write, even for his own use, anything connected with him or his ideas, or any other participants in the work, or keep letters, notes, and so on, still less to publish anything. During the first years, G insisted strongly upon the obligatory nature of this rule, and it was supposed that everyone accepted in the work would give his word to write nothing, and it goes without saying to publish nothing, referring to G without special permission, even in the event of his leaving the work and G. This was one of the fundamental rules. Every new person who joined us heard about it, and it was considered to be fundamental and obligatory. But afterwards G accepted in his work people who paid no attention to this rule and who did not wish to consider it. This explains the subsequent appearance of descriptions of various moments in G's work. all of the books that I've enjoyed reading. I passed the summer of 1921 in Constantinople and in August left for London. Before my departure, G proposed that I should go with him to Germany, where he once more intended to open his institute and prepare his ballet. But in the first place, I did not believe it was possible to organize work in Germany, and secondly, I did not believe that I could work with G. Soon after my arrival in London, I began to give lectures in continuation of the work at Constantinople and Ekaterinodar. I learned that G had gone to Germany with his Tiflis company and with those of my Constantinople people who had joined him. He tried to organize work in Berlin and Dresden and intended to purchase the apartments of the former Institut dal Croce in Helleran near Dresden. But nothing came out of it all, and in connection with the proposed purchase, some strange events took place which ended in legal proceedings. In February 1922, G came to London. I at once invited him as a matter of course to my lectures and introduced him to all who were coming to them. This time my attitude towards him was much more definite. I still expected a very great deal more from his work, and I decided to do everything I could to help him to organize his institute and the preparation of his ballet. But I did not believe it was possible for me to work with him. I saw again all the former obstacles which had begun to appear in Essentuki. This time they had appeared even before he arrived. The outward situation was that G had done very much towards the accomplishment of his plans. The chief thing was that a certain cadre of people, about 20, had been prepared with whom it was possible to begin. The music for the ballet had almost all been prepared with the cooperation of a well-known musician, Thomas de Hartmann, I think, who I've just mentioned a moment ago. The organization of the institute had been worked out, but there was no money to put all this into practice. Soon after his arrival, G said that he thought of opening his institute in England. Many of those who came to my lectures became interested in this idea and arranged a subscription among themselves to cover the material side of the business. A certain sum of money was immediately given to G to prepare for the passage of the whole of his group to England. I continued my lectures, connecting them with what G had said during his stay in London. But I had decided for myself that if the institute opened in London, I would go either to Paris or to America. The institute was finally opened in London, but for various reasons it failed. But my London friends and those who came to my lectures collected a considerable sum of money for him, and with this G bought the historic Chateau Prieur in Avon near Fontainebleau, with an enormous neglected park, and in the autumn of 1922 he opened his institute there. A very motley company, a very motley company assembled there. There were a certain number of people who remembered St. Petersburg. There were pupils of G's from Tiflis. There were people who had come to my lectures in Constantinople and London. The latter were divided into several groups. In my opinion, some had been in far too great a hurry to give up their ordinary occupations in England in order to follow G. I could have said nothing to them because they had already made their decision when they spoke to me about it. I feared that they would meet with disappointment because G's work seemed to me not sufficiently rightly organized and therefore to be unstable. But at the same time I could not be sure of my own opinions and did not want to interfere with them, because if everything went right and my fears proved to be false, then they would undoubtedly have gained by their decision. Others had tried to work with me, but for some reason or other they parted from me and now thought that it would be easier for them to work with G. They were particularly attracted by the idea of finding what they called a short cut. To this, when they asked my advice, I of course advised them to go to Fontainebleau and work with G, and there were others who came to G temporarily for 2 weeks, for a month. These were people who attended my lectures and did not want to decide themselves, but on hearing about other people's decision, had come to me and asked whether they ought to give up everything and go to Fontainebleau, and whether this was the only way to go on with the work. To this I said they should wait until I was there. And so here's Ouspensky telling us about, hello there, Brother Lee, welcome. And here's Ouspensky now going to speak about his time at the chateau. I arrived at the chateau for the first time at the end of October or the beginning of November 1922. Very interesting and animated work was proceeding there. A pavilion had been built for dances and exercises. Housekeeping had been organized. The house had been finished off, and so on. And the atmosphere on the whole was very right and left a strong impression. I remember one talk with Miss Catherine Mansfield, who was then living there. This was not more than 3 weeks before her death. And like I mentioned in the introduction, that Catherine Mansfield was also a famous author, and there's a couple of her stories on the channel if you're interested in that. I had given her G's address myself. She had been to 2 or 3 of my lectures and had then come to me to say that she was going to Paris. A Russian doctor was curing tuberculosis by treating the spleen with x-rays. I could not, of course, tell her anything about it. She already seemed to me to be halfway to death, and I thought that she was fully aware of it. But with all this, one was struck by the striving in her to make the best use even of these last days, to find the truth whose presence she clearly felt, but which she was unable to touch. I did not think that I should see her again, but I could not refuse when she asked me for the address of my friends in Paris, for the address of people with whom she would be able to talk about the same thing she had talked about with me. And so I had met her again at the Prairie. We sat in the evening in one of the salons, and she spoke in a feeble voice, which seemed to come from the void, but it was not unpleasant. I know that this is true, and that there is no other truth. You know that I have long since looked upon all of us without exception as people who have suffered shipwreck, and have been cast upon an uninhabited island, but who do not yet know of it. But these people here know of it. The others there in life still think that a steamer will come for them tomorrow, and that everything will go on in the old way. These already know that there will be no more of the old way. I'm so glad that I came here. And that's Catherine Mansfield's words. Soon after my return to London, I heard of her death. G was very good to her. He did not insist upon her going, although it was clear that she could not live. For this, in the course of time, he received the due amount of lies and slanders, again, that I mentioned in the introduction. Yeah, no one can understand that, right? That someone would just like to die. I believe she was in the top of a stable, in the top of a farmhouse, just on her own, very nice, quiet and peaceful. And sort of even in those days, right, 1923, people are like, oh, you got to go to the hospital, you must go to the hospital, but what if you don't want to go to the hospital? What if you just want to die peacefully in nature, in this nice energetic surroundings, and you don't want to go to the hospital, So, yeah, there's a lot of similarities in this book, that we see today. And, of course, man is, we haven't changed in these times. We're still the same, affected by the same things. During the year 1923, I went fairly often to Fontainebleau, that is, to the Prairie. Soon after its opening, the Institute attracted the attention of the press, and for a month or two the French and English papers were active, writing about it. G and his pupils were called the forest philosophers. They were interviewed, their photographs were published, and so on. G's own work during this time, that is, from 1922, was dedicated chiefly to the development of methods of studying rhythm and plastics. He never stopped working the whole time on his ballet, bringing into it the dances of various dervishes and Sufis, and recalling by memory the music he had listened to in Asia many years before. In this work was a very great deal that was new and interesting. Dervish dances and music were reproduced in Europe undoubtedly for the first time, and they produced a very great impression on all who were able to hear and see them. In the Prairie, also, they carried on very intensive mental exercises for the development of the memory, of attention, and of the imagination, and further, in connection with these exercises, in imitation of psychic phenomena. Then there was a lot of obligatory work for everyone in the house and connected with the housekeeping, which required great strenuousness thanks to the speed of working and various other conditions, the super efforts that we would have read about in chapter 17. From among the talks of that time, I particularly remember one which related to the methods of breathing, and although this talk, as well as many other things that were done then passed unnoticed, it showed the possibility of an entirely fresh point of view on the subject in question. Right exercises, G said once, which lead direct to the aim of mastering the organism and subjecting its conscious and unconscious functions to the will, begin with breathing exercises. Without mastering breathing, nothing can be mastered. At the same time, to master breathing is not so easy. You must realize that there are three kinds of breathing. One is normal breathing, the second is inflation, the third is breathing assisted by movements. What does this mean? It means that normal breathing goes on unconsciously. It is managed and controlled by the moving center. Inflation is artificial breathing. If, for instance, a man says to himself that he will count 10 inhaling and 10 exhaling, or that he will inhale through the right nostril and exhale through the left, this is done by the formatory apparatus. And the breathing itself is different because the moving center and the formatory apparatus act through different groups of muscles. The group of muscles through which the moving center acts are neither accessible nor subordinate to the formatory apparatus, but in the event of a temporary stoppage of the moving center, the formatory apparatus has been given a group of muscles which it can influence and with whose help it can set the breathing mechanism in motion. But its work will, of course, be worse than the work of the moving center, and it cannot go on for long. You have read the book about yogi breathing. You have heard or have also read about the special breathing connected with the mental prayer in Orthodox monasteries. It is all one and the same thing. Breathing proceeding from the formatory apparatus is not breathing, but inflation. The idea is that if a man carries out this kind of breathing long enough and often enough through the formatory apparatus, then the moving center, which remains idle during this period, can get tired of doing nothing and start working in imitation of the formatory apparatus. And indeed, this sometimes happens. But so that this should happen, many conditions are necessary. Fasting and prayer are necessary, and little sleep and all kinds of difficulties and burdens for the body. If the body is well treated, this cannot happen. You think there are no physical exercises in Orthodox monasteries? Well, you try to carry out 100 prostrations according to all the rules. You will have an aching back, so that no kind of gymnastics could ever give. And if you're still here, Brother Lee, I'm sure you resonate with 100 prostrations and these exercises. And like us, I think that's Gurdjieff talking, isn't it? That, you know, he's talking about super efforts, about doing a certain amount of work in half the time, or doing some work. He gives an example in chapter 17. When you walk home in the rain, that's just efforts. But if you arrive at the door, dinner's on the table and the fire's on, and you decide to walk 2 miles up the road and then 2 miles back, that's the super efforts, because it's going above and beyond. And here he's talking about, you know, fasting, prayer, little sleep, and all kinds of other difficulties and burdens for the body. If the body is well treated, it cannot happen. So, like he's saying, you'd need to be in a, I mean, you don't need to be, but to get the results, you have to submit your will to another. And when they say, right, it's 3 o'clock, get up for your prayers and your prostrations. If you say, no, I'm tired, then they say, right, you're in the wrong place, you've got to leave. But sort of to submit your will to another, in a sense, is easier, because they come in at 3 a.m., banging the drum or whatever, they bang the bell to wake people up. And you do it, you get up, you know, you don't listen to the body, you listen to this individual. For me, when I set my alarm for my morning meditation, my body is telling me, my body's, you know, giving me, it's in control. And this is, again, if the body's in control, not much gets done. But sorry for that digression. Let's get back to this bottom here. This all has one aim: to bring breathing into the right muscles, to hand it over to the moving center, and as I said, sometimes this is successful. But there is always a big risk that the moving center will lose its habit of working properly, and since the formatory apparatus cannot work all the time, as for instance during sleep, and the moving center does not want to, then the machine can find itself in a very sorry situation. A man may even die from breathing having stopped. The disorganization of the functions of the machine through breathing exercises is almost inevitable when people try to do breathing exercises from books by themselves without proper instructions. Many people used to come to me in Moscow who had completely disorganized right function of their machines by so-called yogi breathing, which they had learned from books. Books which recommend such exercises represent a great danger. And it's so funny because I've just received what's the gentleman's name? Holotropic Breathwork, the book about holotropic breathing. Stanislav Graf, is it? I believe. I can't remember. I think it is him. And so it's funny here, that is specifically a book about breathing and they're dangerous. The transition of breathing from the control of the formatory apparatus into the control of the moving center can never be attained by amateurs. For this transition to take place, the organism must be brought to the last stage of intensity, but a man himself can never do this. But as I have already said, there is a third way: breathing through movements. This third way needs a very great knowledge of the human machine, and it is employed in schools directed by very learned people. In comparison, all other methods are homemade and unreliable. The fundamental idea of this method consists in the fact that certain movements and postures can call forth any kind of breathing you like, and it is also normal breathing, not inflation. The difficulty is in knowing what movements and what postures will call forth certain kinds of breathing and in what kind of people. This latter is particularly important because people from this point of view are divided into a certain number of definite types, and each type should have its own definite movements to get one and the same breathing, because the same movement produces different breathing with different types. A man who knows the movement which will produce in himself one or another kind of breathing is already able to control his organism, and is able at any moment he likes to set in motion one or another center or cause that part which is working to stop. Of course, the knowledge of these movements and the ability to control them, like everything else in the world, has its degrees. A man can know more or less and make a better or worse use of it. In the meantime, it is important only to understand the principle, and this is particularly important in connection with the study of the divisions of centers in oneself. Mention has been made of this several times before. You must understand that each center is divided into three parts, in conformity with the primary divisions of centers into thinking, emotional, and moving. On the same principle, each of these parts, in its turn, is divided into three. In addition, from the very outset, each center is divided into two parts, positive and negative, and in all parts there are groups of roles connected together, some in one direction and others in another direction. This explains the differences between people, what is called individuality. Of course, there is in this no individuality at all, but simply a difference of roles and associations. The talk took place in the big studio in the garden, decorated by G in the fashion of a dervish tekke. Having explained the meaning of various kinds of breathing, he began to divide those present into three groups according to type. About 45 people were there. G's idea was to show how the same movements with different people produce different moments of breathing, for instance, with some inhalation, with others exhalation, and how different movements and postures can produce one and the same moment of breathing, inhalation, exhalation, and holding the breath. But this experiment was not completed, and as far as I know, G never afterwards returned to it again, and that's the final sort of speech. That's what Ouspensky ends the book with, talking about this uncompleted breathing exercise. But of course, if he were to stay there at Fontainebleau, perhaps he would have gone deeper into that line of work. And this is the concluding paragraph. During this period, G invited me several times to go and live at the Prairie. There was a good deal of temptation in this, but in spite of all my interest in G's work, I could find no place for myself in this work, nor did I understand its direction. At the same time, I could not fail to see, as I had seen in Essentuki in 1918, that there were many destructive elements in the organization of the affair itself, and that it had to fall to pieces. In December 1923, G arranged demonstrations of dervish dances, rhythmic movements and various exercises in Paris, in the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées. Soon after these demonstrations, in the beginning of January 1924, G, together with a part of his pupils, went to America with the intention of arranging lectures and demonstrations there. I was at the Prairie on the day of his departure, and this departure reminded me very much of his departure from Essentuki in 1918 and all that was connected with it. On returning to London, I announced to those who came to my lectures that my work in the future would proceed quite independently in the way it had begun in London in 1921. And that is the end of Ouspensky's In Search of the Miraculous. And again, as we saw there, as the book progressed and we got to the last sort of 3 or 4 chapters, particularly that last chapter, chapter 17, Ouspensky clearly enjoyed and relished in the intellectual side of things. And when Gurdjieff went away from the intellectual side of things, he sort of, he was repelled a bit by it. He wasn't interested in these dances, in these breathing things and the movements and stuff. He wanted the ideas, he wanted to go deeper into it. And so, of course, like I think I was talking in chapter 17, he went away. He bifurcated from Gurdjieff and went off and did his own thing, where he can expound his lectures to his heart's content and have other intellectuals there, asking him questions. And then we get the book The Fourth Way, which is a series of his meetings, his question and answer sessions, and there's also other stuff in there. And so, that's Ouspensky's In Search of the Miraculous. Anything I've been saying about Ouspensky in this last couple of chapters is not to disparage anyone. I feel, for me, this is my favourite Gurdjieff book, In Search of the Miraculous. So I'm not being at all disparaging towards Ouspensky, because for me, without this book, I don't feel I would be involved or at all interested in the Gurdjieff work, because I'm interested, like Ouspensky, in these sort of esoteric ideas and the diagrams and the concepts. That's what I like. And so if I just had Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson or Meetings with Remarkable Men, I may not have become as interested as I now am. Now I've branched out and I've read all the other books. And so I see that it's not just about the intellect. It's not enough. You need the 3 centers, like Gurdjieff says, or this is the fourth way, isn't it? There is a fourth way to the combination of all the centers, the thinking, the emotional, and the moving. And this is what I believe is the self-remembering, the awareness, the consciousness that people are after, the combination of all these centers when receiving an impression. And it sort of, again, I won't go into all the hydrogens and the food diagram because that's from another chapter, and it's not really appropriate here at the end of this wonderful project that I very much enjoyed. It took a long time. I'm sure, as I've said previously, some of the chapters won't make any sense. It will be like a foreign language, and that's how it was for me in the beginning and how it is for me now. To be fair, a lot of the concepts I do struggle still to grasp, particularly the octaves and several of the other more technical sides of things. The math is very difficult. But I've got a great deal out of this book. I hope you have too. I hope you will go back to particular chapters over and over again, and that maybe you'll even pick up your own copy, whether it's this new modern Harcourt publication, or maybe you'll seek out a first edition or some other edition of In Search of the Miraculous, because there are many. And like I say, it's been a great joy to share this with you all, and I'm very much looking forward to. I haven't read Meetings with Remarkable Men for many years, so hopefully we'll get through that very quickly, because that's a book that my own personal interest and the channel, it's a combination. So when these things happen, my own interest, I want to read it and I want to share it on the channel. This is the best combination for a book, in my opinion, and for book club. But as there's no questions, no comments, no queries, that's it for this evening. I'll say farewell. At the weekend, on Sunday, we're going to read Suzanne Collins's Hunger Games Mockingjay. And I'm looking forward to share that with you. So, yeah, thanks everyone for joining, for being here, for listening to Ouspensky's telling of his time with Gurdjieff. I hope that you can take some of these ideas, some of these concepts into your own life, and wake up, or at least awaken, cease to be a machine and asleep, and get as much out of life as you possibly can. So Frank, I appreciate you being here. I'm glad you enjoyed it. You're very welcome, and it's nice to see you. Your first stream, your first live. Welcome, and I hope you can make many more. Marcella, you're welcome, and I'm glad you're looking forward to Gurdjieff's own writing. You should be, because they're wonderful. And everyone, Peter Lee, thanks for popping in. Lovely to see you as well. And Google sucks. You're very welcome, and it's nice to see you. And so, Sunday at 8, we're back to the later time now, the normal time of 8. Hope you can make it for a sort of dystopian, revolutionary feel of Hunger Games. And I hope that very soon we can read the introduction to Meetings with Remarkable Men. But for now, farewell, look after yourselves. Go back to the beginning of chapter 1 of In Search of the Miraculous. Begin your studies again. Try and get some more juice out of it. Some more consciousness raising information. All the best. Look after yourselves, and I'll see you soon. Bye guys. Take care.